everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to wait a few moments while everyone starts to file in because I know that it always takes a few minutes for everybody to join. We're going to go ahead and get started with our panel on IT and global business and here in just a few seconds. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Urban Language Teaching and Research at Georgia State University. This is the 6th annual World Languages Week. I'm sure some of you have been availing yourselves of all the great programming that's been going on during the week. I think one of the great things about this new world we're living in is we can engage with different content. So CULTR, as the center is known, is one of 16 federally funded Title VI language resource centers in the United States. And it's created a unique identity around serving the needs of students and all students in the communities they represent, promoting language learning as part of 21st century global education. And I am Trevor Williams. I am a journalist from Global Atlanta. So we are a news publication that focuses on international business, diplomacy, trade, culture, and education, of course, as it applies to our city and state here in Atlanta, Georgia. So we're excited to be with this panel and working with Georgia State on many different things, but working with CULTR in particular to beef up our language instruction here in the state. I think it's great what's being done. So before introducing all the panelists, we're going to address a few housekeeping issues. If you're interrupted, if your connection goes bad, which we've all been dealing with on occasion these days, you can just rejoin with the same link that you've used previously to join. Hopefully this will be a problem. If the event reaches capacity, you can tune into the live stream on YouTube. But we're going to do a panel discussion of approximately 35 to 40 minutes. Then we'll do a Q&A with the attendees, with you. And if you would like to ask a question, I would encourage you to go ahead and get up your gumption and go ahead and type it into the Q&A, even when you think of it. Don't wait till the end. We can start to moderate those as we go. And it may be that we want to address the question in the middle of the panel versus waiting until the end. So go ahead and do that, and don't be afraid. We're not going to bite. So I think the chat function is disabled, but do use the Q&A function. And then at the end, the event website will have the curriculum guide for teachers, and then students will have the instructions to download the Goose Chase app, which sounds really fun. I'm not sure we're going to have access to that, but I might try to get it. So it's a virtual scavenger hunt, and prizes will be awarded to those schools with the top scores. So instead of babbling on, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists. We have got a great panel for you today, 4 different speakers representing a wide variety of languages and industries and cultures here. So I'm excited about this. We've got Erica Bolden, who's the head of diversity, inclusion, and corporate social responsibility from Mercedes-Benz USA. Hey, Erica, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good, thank you. So Erica oversees internal and external relationships and designs strategies to attract, develop, and advance the most talented individuals in support of Daimler, which is the parent company of Mercedes-Benz. Daimler's commitment to foster a diverse workforce and inclusive environment. Before Mercedes-Benz, Erica was director of diversity for Perkins, and I can never get the Perkins Coie.
Yeah, there you go.
I've interacted with them before and never been able to get that right. And then before, this is a law firm with 19 offices across the US and Asia. She also worked for 10 years at PricewaterhouseCoopers, also known as PwC. So thanks for being with us, Erica. I could read your bio, but then we might be here all day because you've done so many things. We've got Christian Hoffala, who is Christian, welcome.
Hey, welcome everybody.
Yeah, so Christian's a cultural coach, trainer, and mentor, works with a lot of multinationals. And I love this. He is based in Atlanta, but German by passport, American by choice, Bavarian at heart. So I love that. And he really sees his work as a mission to create peace and understanding, and helps people just figure out culture and how to interact with people and across languages and across cultures, and really find their commonalities versus their differences. So thanks, Christian, for being here. And yeah, we've got Steve Krubiner. And Steve, welcome.
Thank you so much, Trevor. It's good to be here.
Yes, thank you. And I'm not sure if I mentioned Christian's company, the CULTR Mastery. Sorry, I didn't bring that out, Christian. But Stephen is the founder and CEO of Conversify, a name which I think is really cool. And Stephen is really experienced in the international realm and also in the innovation and entrepreneurship realm. He's worked on quite a number of conflict resolution initiatives. He's worked on 3 continents and 4 languages, led teams of 12 nationalities. He's well-versed in mediation and management. And his current venture, Conversify, I'll get him to talk about that, is really the culmination of a lot of entrepreneurial ventures over the years. So I'll get him to speak more about that, so I don't belabor it too much here. But we also got, last but not least, Jennifer Peacock. Jennifer, thanks for being with us.
Hi, hello. Thanks for having me.
Guten Tag. Jennifer works with Svik Rule, a leading supplier of materials testing systems and solutions worldwide. And she is executive assistant to the managing director of marketing. And Jennifer, we were talking before the panel began about her journey as a German interpreter over the years and how she got educated for that. So we'll speak more about that as we go. So I guess to start off, I want to get each of you to speak about, just how you got into studying language. And let's talk about, your own personal language learning journey. What inspired you to get into learning other languages? Was it strategic? Was it planned? Was it something that you fell into? Talk about that journey and how you chose the languages you even tried to study.
Sure. Thanks. And thanks to my fellow panelists for being here today. I'm really excited for this conversation. I, like many people, I think began studying foreign language because it was a requirement at my school. I started learning Spanish in middle school. We had, I think, 2 options, Spanish and French. And I was drawn to Spanish just because I thought that it would be a language that would be really useful for me in my day-to-day future in the US. And that has proven to be true. I've used Spanish almost every day of my life, both in the US and abroad. And I continued with it in college. I went to a university that had a 9-semester requirement for foreign language. And some of you may be doing the math. There's only 8 semesters in most undergraduate programs. So we had to either come in with some language or make it up somehow. So I continued with Spanish. I studied abroad in Spain. And this speaks to a conversation we were having earlier, but I remember when I landed in Madrid, I studied abroad in Segovia, which is about an hour north of Madrid. And I chose it because I thought there would be very few Americans there and it'd be a great place for me to really immerse myself. But I came a few days early and I was in Madrid and I went to check into a hostel. And I remember on the plane over, I was like, I'm fluent in Spanish. I've been studying for 9 years. This is going to be like one long, fiesta semester. And I go to check in and the woman who was working at the hostel starts speaking to me in a very thick Castellano accent. And I was like, I don't understand a thing you're saying to me. And it took me a good month before I could start even understanding the accent, even though I had done so much work in language learning. And then as you said, Trevor, I spent a lot of my career working in international conflict resolution, the majority of that on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so soon after I finished my undergrad, I moved to the Middle East. And when I was living in Jerusalem, I thought and was told, you really will do far better if you learn the languages. And so I enrolled in a master's degree in Hebrew that was in Islamic and Middle Eastern studies. So I would have to learn Arabic and Hebrew in order to get the degree.
Glutton for punishment.
Yeah, glutton for punishment. and I'm actually not somebody who's very good at learning languages, but I know that if I work hard at it and if I surround myself and I immerse myself, I can pick it up.
Tell us how that experience, having to learn those languages, fed into what you're doing today with Conversify. I think that would be a good transition point.
Sure. I mean, one of the things, so I worked for 15 years on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and one of the things that was a constant theme throughout my work was the impact that speaking another language has on breaking down cultural divides and creating connections between people. Whether that was Israelis speaking Arabic, Palestinians speaking Hebrew, or me myself as an American speaking, Hebrew or Arabic. And so, and that's made a huge difference. And so the other thing just for me is I've had tremendous amounts of doors open because of the languages that I speak. So I remember one day my boss came into my office in Jerusalem and said, "Hey, Steve, I need you to go to Madrid for 6 months." And I said, "Madrid? Like we're working on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm already living abroad." And he said, don't get me wrong, I was excited to go to Madrid. But he said, "Hey, look, the King of Spain and the Foreign Ministry of Spain are putting together an Arab-Israeli peace conference, and you're my only guy who speaks Spanish, Hebrew, and Arabic. So, you're on." And
Wow.
and it turned out to be one of the most rewarding, experiences of my life. And I was calling prime ministers and foreign ministers and inviting all sorts of folks in my foreign languages. So it's been a tremendous experience. And so because of that, and because I know that I learn languages best through immersion, a few years ago, I started a company, Conversify, which basically offers students the opportunity to have access to immersion on demand. So basically, we're willing to get into strangers' cars with Uber. We're willing to stay in strangers' homes with Airbnb. Why not be willing to hop on a call on demand with somebody, a video call with somebody around the world, connect with them and practice the language you're learning in real time? There's no reason to wait 9 years until you might be lucky enough to study abroad. Right. You can do it every single day and just reinforce what you're learning. And so that was the origins of Conversify.
Yeah, and I'd imagine there's an equalizer effect to that too. Like, if you can't go abroad, there's ways to kind of use technology to avail yourself of that experience, even if you can't do it in person. So that's
absolutely
one advantage that we're all finding in technology these days. But Christian, I wanted to bring you in to talk about the culture mastery a little bit. I mean, language and culture are inseparable, but you can study a culture without learning a language. So why, how have you seen people supercharge their learning of culture through language, and how important is that?
That is a great question, but you stumped me there a little bit, because to me, learning about another culture, the gateway to that for me was always the language. So without the language, it would have been hard for me to engage with another culture. Of course, now as I have made that turn as a teenager or a preteen learning another language, to answer the question that you said earlier, I grew up in Europe. Most European countries are surrounded by neighbors who don't speak the same language. So it is a prerequisite within Europe to know at least one of your neighbors' languages. So for us, there was no question. So English was the first language that I studied in school. And then later on, my grandfather pushed me towards studying Latin, which I had for, believe it or not, for 6 years, which I loathed for a while. And yet now, in my adulthood, I recognize that it's the foundation of all the Romance languages, makes my Spanish, Italian, Portuguese a little easier to apply. Had I not studied another language, I probably would have not engaged at the level with another culture as I did as a foreign exchange student. I came to the United States at the age of 17, became a foreign exchange student in northwestern Minnesota. Yeah, you betcha. If you watch the movie Fargo, then you know where I spent the year 1988. It was exactly like that. And the fact that I had studied English up to that point allowed me to delve into another culture. And yes, it is now in my adulthood, having learned other languages, I now can engage with other cultures without knowing their language well, because I know what it takes to pick apart a culture or look for the markers and the identifiers. Right. But without the language, it's exponentially much harder. So I would always advocate for learn the language and also immerse yourself in the culture, because on the flip side, you can, just like Stephen said, you can learn Spanish for 9 years and never apply it in a full immersion, and your skill levels will always be restricted to the lab setting. But at some point, you got to take the lab knowledge out into the real world. And I applaud you, Stephen, for that business model, because especially this year, where international travel has been really cumbersome, your idea might be a saving grace for a lot of those language students who need that immersion with a native speaker. Kudos to you.
Yeah, and I think one thing I think about, having studied Chinese a bit, I'm not fluent at all, of course, but is endurance, right? Like, you need endurance to really learn a language. You heard Steve talk about, studying 9 years and getting off the plane and being in for a rude awakening. I mean, if you're going to really learn it, you've got to have some cultural draws that keep you coming back to it. You've got to be genuinely interested in not just the linguistic part, but actually the culture behind it, because that's what's going to keep you learning, and it's going to connect you with people where you're going to actually learn and practice. Other than that, it's going to be theoretical, and it's never going to get down to the heart. Erica, I wanted to talk to you about that too. I know you studied Spanish at University of Miami in Ohio, not in
Miami
Florida.
University, close.
Miami University, yeah. Sorry about that.
Here's a little thing that you have enthusiasts from my alma mater. They'll tell you that our university was established before Florida was a state.
There you go.
But just a little factoid for you. But yeah, the one in Ohio.
Something about those universities in Ohio, because the Ohio State people like to say the Ohio State University.
It is the Ohio. That is exactly right.
So tell us about how you got into Spanish. Was it eventually you ended up studying it relatively formally in your undergrad days at least, but was it kind of like Steve, just kind of fell into it because it was a requirement?
So, in elementary school, we had the offerings, there was a hard and fast rule at that point, but, same deal, Spanish or French. I chose Spanish, and I'm multicultural. So, and looking at my, my heritage and my background, that was the only thing missing. So, being the ambitious child that I was, I'll study Spanish and just round it on out. And now I've got all the boxes ticked. But I always loved and enjoyed studying it. I'd have all my stuffed animals lined up, and I had a chalkboard, and I was doing Spanish lessons, and I was making flashcards, teaching the dog, and just continued to study it. So, got to a high school level where there were the requisites there put in place, and continued to study in high school. Same deal, did the pre-testing coming to the university, was able to be placed in advanced classes, already getting the high school credit for it, which, put me on the fast track. And one of those things I just, even though it was not a requirement for my major necessarily, I just continued to enjoy studying it, and then had enough credits for a minor. Then in doing my project for my internship and establishing my degree program, decided to go ahead and make it a double major. So unfortunately, it was more, my route was a little bit non-traditional by happenstance. That's how I came to have a dual degree program. I didn't, the immersion piece is critical as far as learning. I was immersed, but in the lab, as Christian said, right, in a classroom setting. I did not travel abroad, and so was able to do so later on in life socially, but that immersion piece is critical. But I did study Spanish linguistics and culture, so that did give me a bit of an advantage where it tied the linguistics, studying how your brain actually comprehends and learns languages in addition to understanding the culture.
Definitely. I'm with you. In college, I got a few, 2-week trips to China here and there, but I never got to go study abroad and get the genuine kind of immersion experience. But even the limited immersion that you get does wonders for you. And even if you're not fluent, the doors can open when you have this in your toolkit. I think even if it's not a completely sharp tool, you can still use it. Jennifer, I think we got you back. Are you there?
I'm here.
All right, good.
I'm so sorry. My computer went down, so I grabbed my cell phone, and here I am.
Hey, well, we just kept it flowing without you, but we're glad you're back. So we were just talking about how everybody kind of got into the languages that they've studied. I know that you were in Colorado, did your bachelor's in international affairs and also minored in German, but then went on to get your master's in German as well, and parlayed that into interpretation. So how did you get there?
Well,
what initially spurred your interest, and how did you kind of keep the fire burning?
So I would say my beginnings were a little bit less practical and more based on what I was interested in. As a child, I loved looking at maps, and I loved listening to people speaking foreign languages. And so I decided to pursue something in my undergraduate that would sort of allow me to be around that in terms of in political science, international affairs degree. And then I graduated and I realized, what am I going to do in Denver with an international affairs degree? So I had a minor in German, and I had studied abroad for a year, my senior year of college, which was amazing. And I said, you know what, I think I need to find something a little more practical. So that's when I decided to get an MA in German translation and kind of built my career off of that. It's led me in so many different directions. It's not at all what I thought it would be when I first started studying it. But one thing I can say is it drove me to really become good at speaking a foreign language. It's an absolute necessity as a translator or an interpreter, and to have a very wide vocabulary of a lot of technical terms. So whether you're a legal translator or a medical translator or a technical translator, you really have to know the terminology in both languages that you're working with.
Well, you talked about making it practical, right? Getting to your master's to the point where it was something that you could actually spin into a career. And kudos to you for doing that. Not all of us get there, right? In languages, and we have to make what we have practical. And I was wondering if our other panelists may talk about just how you view language as an asset for employees that you may be looking at, or companies that you may be working with. And maybe start with Erica. I mean, you head up diversity initiatives, and of course, diversity is many things to many people, but it's all about bringing in different ideas and getting new perspectives and ensuring that we're valuing the perspectives of all of our employees. But does language fit into the diversity equation when you're at Mercedes-Benz USA?
Absolutely. And even if I think about just my own career path, graduating from college, I worked for a management consulting firm, and I was, the most junior consultant being put on international projects just because of a language capability. So being put on a project, going, with one of our senior partners to Juarez, Mexico, which was a very interesting trip and very eye-opening, but it was great just being able to have that level of exposure. So it certainly does put you on a fast track. Here at Mercedes-Benz USA, our headquarters are here in Atlanta area, but our parent company is Daimler, and they are based in Stuttgart, Germany. So we do have a lot of expats who are German. I actually have it on my list to learn German, so I don't have to keep hitting the translation for a lot of the emails or the sidebar conversations when I'm calling my colleagues in Germany. But absolutely, it is a complete asset and skill, no matter what language you speak. And I always like to tell folks, never be ashamed of having an accent. Anytime I hear someone speak to me and they have an accent that is non-English, my brain is like, oh, wow, that person is incredible. English is a very hard language to learn as a non-native speaker. As you can hear, native speakers, we make all kind of flubs as it is as native speakers. So to have someone come, it's one of the hardest languages to learn. But for me, just to have that dexterity is a super duper asset to have as a professional. And of course, when we talk about diversity, that can be defined broadly. Usually you start to think about diversity with respect to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, but it also encompasses thinking styles. Where did you grow up? Are you foreign born? Your geographic location? Are you a parent, a caretaker? All of these various things, right? So for me, anytime I see that someone has language as a skill, that's always a plus. And I did see the question in the chat as far as how we define fluency. I said there is definitely a difference between proficiency and fluency. So, as I mentioned, I have a degree in Spanish. However, I never traveled abroad. To be fluent, I feel you need to have a good handle on the colloquialisms or the slang. If you're to pick someone up and go into the countryside, or into the city, do you have that fluency? So I do not say that I'm fluent. I say that I'm proficient. I have a business proficiency, meaning I can read business text. I can, speak, have conversations, at a basis to get around if I travel, but I certainly don't say that I'm fluent. So I would caution those of you who do study, if you put that on your resume that you are fluent, if you do that, be prepared for your interviewer to speak the language and conduct the whole interview in that language. If you can't do that, then I would be really transparent around what that level of proficiency is, but it's always an asset. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's something that you can't fake for sure. I mean, I always tell people I'm conversational. I don't even use the word proficient with Chinese because once you get
Conversational,
into that, then,
that's even more transparent.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly. I'll have people that introduce me. Oh, this guy can speak. I'm like, no, he can't. Let's set the record straight before we get too deep, right? Get into some vocabulary that I can't handle. But yeah, very, very interesting that that's a piece of diversity. That's a piece of everybody's story. Like that's one more thing that adds on top of all the other things that make you unique. So I think it's very important to point out for sure.
Yeah. And all the other thing I would add to that too is, just being foreign born. I know sometimes just for ease of English speakers to be able to pronounce your name. Sometimes we were talking about this earlier. Sometimes people will adopt an English sounding name, and that's fine. But I would just stress that there really is no need to do that for acceptance. And what I always do is when someone has a name that might be difficult for someone to pronounce, I ask them to take some time to teach me how to say your name, where you come from, your culture, your heritage. Your name is beautiful, right? And I'm sure it carries some importance, and you should have pride in that. So if someone messes up the pronunciation of your name, to say, just let you know you're pronouncing my name incorrectly. It is, and you gently correct them, or can we spend a few minutes, kind of going over practicing the pronunciation of my name. So don't feel compelled to change your name to something that is easier to pronounce for your English speaking colleagues. Don't do that. And if you have an accent, again, don't be ashamed of it, because for me, that just signals that you're smarter than most of the folks in the room.
Yeah, and raise the bar for us monolingual Americans. Let's put it that way.
I tell you, Americans are spoiled for sure.
Yeah.
For
well,
sure.
I mean, your point about the accent is so important, because I think when you study another language, you remember how you feel trying to speak that language and how much your accent comes out when you're even trying to get to that level of proficiency. And when you see someone speaking fluent English, but just with a little tinge of their mother tongue, it's something to be admired, not to be scoffed at.
Absolutely.
When you can remember how that feels to be on the other end, for sure. So it creates empathy, definitely. So Steve, how do you look at language when it comes to your team? I mean, obviously, y'all are all about language and what you do, right? So I would assume that, anytime you're looking at new employees, they're going to have at least an appreciation for what you do. And then in technology as well, people think, oh, it's just coding, right? But I've noticed that the more, teams are working cross-border and globally, the more important, at least that empathy that comes with language learning has become in technology. I wonder if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things in tech is that, or for our company at least, is I've come to really appreciate that every language you can code in is another language. And it may have less of a cultural, or at least a cultural aspect that I understand. But for everyone on our tech team, and our tech team is all in Argentina, for everyone on our tech team, every language that they can code in is another language. And so some of them will say, I speak 2 human languages and 6 computer languages.
Yeah.
But one of the things that's really important to me, and this is beyond just Conversify, but certainly at Conversify, is I really want a team that's excited to use our product. So it's not so important to me that someone comes on and they can already speak Spanish or another language. It's that they want to be learning and they want to be having the exchange and going through the process. But I do find that employees who have learned another language have sort of opened up another part of their brain, and they can think differently and think more creatively. And there's a concept in language learning called circumlocution, where when you don't know a word, you find a different way to say it. And I think that applies not just to language learning, it applies to all roadblocks that you can bump into when you're working in a professional environment. And the ability to circumlocute in language, I think, translates in the brain into being able to find other ways to be creative and find solutions and bring solutions to your boss in the workplace. And so I definitely deeply appreciate folks who have spent time trying to learn a language and immerse themselves in another culture. Similarly, in learning to immerse yourself in another culture, workplaces also have a culture, and you need to learn to adapt to that culture. And so these skills that come with cultural fluency and the ability to, move in and out of different cultures applies, 150% in a workplace as well. And so, and I see that with folks who have spent time in other countries, in other languages, in other cultures.
Yeah, I think for me, it comes down to confidence, right? Like, you get these small wins in the language or in the travel experience or getting from the airport to your hotel and you getting in that taxi and telling the guy where you want to go. And all of these things add up and they build your confidence and your independence. And for me, like I can see in my brain how I try to find solutions versus dwelling on the roadblocks based on having to do that while I've traveled to so many other places, even places where I'm not trying to speak the language. And in fact, sometimes it's even more satisfying when you can get around in Mongolia than in a place where you speak the language. So, Christian, when do you find that companies realize the value of cross-cultural training? Like, do they wait until they get into, now I'm doing business in Korea, in order to start doing that, or are companies becoming more aware of the things that Steve mentioned, the intangible value of these things for their employees?
I think it depends on the global maturity of a company. If a company's been doing business global for a while, then they've begun recognizing the validity and the importance of, as Steve said, cultural fluency. Oftentimes, companies who begin their journey to become more international, and that's a lot of the companies that we've been working with in the last 10 years, where a lot of German or European, in Germany it's called Mittelstand, so it's small entrepreneurs, companies between 500 and 15,000 employees who are just starting out to expand outside of Europe. They usually don't see that as a pressing issue. What they worry about first is, do I have my financing in place? Are my visa taken care of? And how do I find the best talent to work for us abroad? And then they fall on their faces and they recognize, oops, it isn't as easy abroad as it is at home. And what we do, what we're so good at, isn't necessarily translating equally into the other market. And that's when they recognize, dang it, there is something intangible that we didn't recognize before. And when Erica was talking, I was reminded of the work that we do for companies like Erica's or Jennifer's. Much of our work touches the so-called expatriate population of an organization. When companies move people from one part of the world into another, and they expect them to be just as functional overseas as they were at home, or even better. And if companies don't address that at the beginning, at the start of that employee journey, they're not setting their team members up for success. So for us as a team, it's important that I will not hire somebody to work for a client if they don't speak the language of the client. So we've done lots of this work for companies like Zwickau or Mercedes, and we placed, or we positioned team members with their assignees who spoke French, German, Italian, Chinese, Japanese, whatever it was required, right? And it may seem, I think Erica said we're spoiled here in the US. I'm not sure if I would, as a foreigner, I wouldn't say that. I would say the US is blessed with the fact that it is a big territory spanning from coast to coast, a big domestic market, that there is not the strong economic pressure to learn another language as it would be in Europe or in other parts of the world. So whether that's spoiled or just being in a fortunate position, however, do not underestimate the validity of foreign language acquisition, because you will become more employable even within the US. You may not even have to travel at all. But like Steve said, or Erica and Jennifer said, if you know that other language, you will be put on assignments that nobody else will be put on. And typically those are assignments that are rewarding, both in terms of what you do and how you compensate. Yeah,
well, I can vouch for that. I mean, when Delta was starting a flight to China, who did they send to report on it? It was me, even though, again, not fluent, but hey, wasn't he the guy that studied some Chinese in school? Send him.
This is what got me started in that journey. Before I did what I did today, I was a journalist like you. I worked for a German media company. And every time we needed to talk to English-speaking partners, it was, hey, let Christian do it. He gets them. So I worked in the entertainment industry back then. So guess who did the interview with Jay-Z or with Missy Elliott? Not my colleague. They sent me. Yippee yay.
That's awesome. So Jennifer, I wanted to ask you about that. You made the transition from interpreter to now working in marketing. And I wondered if you could talk about, obviously it's very intense to get to the level where you can be an interpreter, but also, you're now translating that skill into, the on the ground sort of communications with clients and things like that for Zwickler. So I wondered if you could talk about, the difference between working as an interpreter and working just in that foreign language.
Sure. So working as a translator, which is the translation of the written word, or an interpreter, which is the translation of the spoken word, may seem very straightforward, right? You're interpreting these words into these words so that people can understand, but you're interpreting ideas, you're interpreting feelings, you're interpreting concepts that may not even exist in one of the cultures / languages that you're working in. And so when I transitioned into marketing, it was very similar. I was at the company, and they're a German-based company, and we are present here in the North American market. And I said, this is German marketing. We need American marketing. We don't look at it that way here. We look at it this way. The approach needs to be tweaked. It wasn't like we had to scrap everything. You just need that middle person, as Christian said, the person who gets it. And it's really, learning a language is not just conveying words, it's conveying so much more. And so I found that, with my training as a translator and an interpreter, it was a very easy switch for me to move into marketing, because A, of that, I get that, but B, I had translated so much marketing material as a translator. Companies would come and say, we have this brochure, or we have a new marketing campaign. How do we say this in English? And it was the back and forth of, you can't use that word. Nope, that's not going to work. Ooh, that brings up bad connotation for us. So it was an easy transition. It was challenging because it was a new field, but it was easy to slide right into it, I would say.
Definitely. Erica, I wanted to ask you, it struck me that Mercedes-Benz has so many different strata of operations, right? Like you have the manufacturing floor, you got the dealerships, you got the corporate headquarters, you got to engage with the folks back in Germany. I mean, there's just so many layers to it, particularly here in the US market. So how do y'all, is language as important at all the various levels as it is, maybe in the executive positions?
We are a German company through and through. So again, we've got a lot of expats, and we're a Daimler company. So in BUSA, we are essentially the marketing and sales arm for Daimler. So we market, we sell, we distribute Mercedes-Benz passenger cars and vans. And then you've got these various entities under the Daimler network. Little known fact as far as dealerships goes, really the only one that MBUSA owns is Mercedes-Benz Manhattan. And the others are independent businesses. Those are franchises. However, that dealer network, we still absolutely interact with them. We have our plant, which is MBUS International, which is in Alabama. So, a lot of your SUVs, those are being the new Maybach is being manufactured down there. And then you've got Mercedes-Benz Financial Services, which is our captive financial company. So you have all of these various entities, but you absolutely see the German language throughout that because of the parent company being Daimler. However, definitely have the global network, and we've got actually the CEO who is coming in January, our new CEO. He's actually coming from Mercedes-Benz Korea. So coming from South Korea, and I believe his ethnicity, he's Greek. So definitely very intercultural company, and it's, you do see the language barriers. The one thing I would say though, because we are in the US, and the acknowledgement that many of the folks who are based in the US, we don't speak German. So there is that underlying, hey, don't send emails to colleagues in German, make them in English, and common spaces speak English. But yeah,
Yeah.
Yep.
So I wanted to ask you kind of the reverse question too. And obviously, y'all have even more, like I remember reporting about your innovation center in Buckhead, and, just how the various teams from Germany, China, and Atlanta were all working together on some of these new innovation initiatives. And they had brought the team over from China to get the Atlanta one started, which I think was just amazing. But how do you translate backwards diversity goals into German idea?
That's a whole other
I'm just curious about that, and people are being really great about putting questions in, so we're about to go to Q&A, but I just wanted to ask you about that real quick.
No, that's a great question. So definitely a lot of my focus here, the gender narrative, the conversation, especially here in the US, as we are all continuing to see, although the topics are not new, here in the US, we are hyper focused on race and ethnicity, right? So continuing to have these conversations, leading these, what I'm calling courageous conversations, to really have an understanding of what is race, where did it come from, why is it here? And it's really laying that foundation, not only for our American colleagues, but for those who were not born here in the U.S. to understand that the founding of this nation revolves around these concepts of race and racism. Our country has never been without it, whereas in Europe, they've got churches that are older than our nation, right? Usually that conversation around gender in Europe is more around, the diversity conversation is more around gender. They can do things in Europe that we can't do here. They can mandate, for example, that X number of women be appointed to leadership positions. We can have that as an aggressive target or goal, but it doesn't look the same. So it's continuing to have these conversations with our, we call it a working group, our global diversity office, and trading these conversations. Even just the terminology that's used. So in Europe, they may have the word, if you're thinking about various communities, they may say tolerance, where here in the U.S., that's not a word that we typically embrace here in the U.S. We want to be more than tolerant. We're embracing it, right? So it's a continued journey, and that's the whole thing when it comes to diversity and inclusion, those conversations. It's a continuum, right? It's never ever static. The conversations are always evolving, but it does look very interesting to bring everyone along in the conversation.
Well, and you talked about the importance of those slight tweaks in verbiage, like tolerance versus embracing, right? Like even knowing that stuff and knowing that that's the kind of words that they use in that language, in that culture, that can help you when you're translating back into their mindset, what you're trying to get across. So again, y'all are being so great about sending questions. I'm very impressed. So I'm going to go ahead, since we're now at 12:42, we're going to go ahead and run into some of the questions. And we may circle back to some of these topics that we've addressed tangentially, but get a little bit deeper into. But the one that's been upvoted the most, it looks like, is one from Colby Hall for Steve. And he was asking, could you name a barrier during your time working on the Israel-Palestine conflict that you would not have been able to overcome without knowing both Arabic and Hebrew?
All right, Colby, that's an awesome question, Colby. Thank you for asking that. I'll try to share a few examples, but I think everything boils down to one word, which is trust. So it is so important in life, but certainly in conflict resolution, to be able to build trust with both sides of a conflict. And so some tangible examples, there were several times that I've been stuck on either side of a checkpoint or a border crossing, where if I wasn't able to speak in Hebrew or Arabic with the security people in charge of that checkpoint or that side of the checkpoint, I would have been able to get through, and I wouldn't have been able to get my group through, or whoever was in my car. And I would have been forced to spend a night somewhere that I might not have wanted to. Anyway, so that
slows the work down.
It slows the work down for sure. I think being able to speak Hebrew and Arabic created participation, which again, I think transcends the specific conflict, but being able to follow a conversation, being invited into the jokes, and hearing the nuances of your colleagues when they're speaking their own language as opposed to speaking your language of English, made a huge difference and opened many doors. Especially, I worked a lot with journalists at different times, and I think that's a really important place that it's important to be able to participate in a conversation in the other person's language. I think with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially as an outsider, as an American coming in, there's a lot of suspicion, and everyone's sort of trying to figure out, like, are you pro-Israel? Are you pro-Palestinian? concepts that I don't actually agree with, but that's a subject of a different conversation. But there's a lot of suspicion. And so I think showing an investment in your interlocutor, again, this transcends Israeli-Palestinian conflict, showing an investment in their language, in their culture, one that is it's very clear that if you learn someone else's language, you put in a lot of time and a lot of effort, and you're making an effort to you don't care about being embarrassed if you make a few mistakes. You're demonstrating, I'm willing to go above that. And that creates trust immediately. And so I've seen that time and again. And I worked in offices where half my colleagues were Israeli and half were Palestinian. And I don't think I would have been able to get the work done with half of them if I only spoke one of their languages, or I would have, but it would have been much harder. So I think those are some tangible and intangible examples of how I think speaking both languages makes a big difference. But it's certainly in all kinds of international work, there's distrust of just parachuting in and trying to get something done. And if you show that you speak or are trying to speak another person's language, it makes a huge example. And just another very quick example, there have been dozens of conversations that I've started with political leaders where the conversation started in Arabic, where we just said, how's your family? How are you? How was your weekend? And then we switched to English. The conversation we probably both knew was always going to be in English. But the fact that we started out those first 5 minutes in Arabic made all the difference in the world for the subsequent conversation. And by the way, that amount of Arabic that you need for that first 5 minutes is not that much.
Right.
And it makes an incredible difference.
Yeah. Well, I was actually going to say something just like that. I mean, I don't do interviews generally in Chinese or Spanish because I'm not really good enough to get, the rapid fire responses and things like that. But I do the same thing. Like I'll start the conversation in Chinese just to get the person going and say, hey, do you mind if we switch to English? Just so I can make sure I understand everything that's going on. And that has been invaluable in getting the person to warm up and building a rapport. And then, on the flip side, when you do know some of the language, you can see why they say things in English the way they do. So you can sort of get a better idea of what they're actually meaning when they're speaking a second language, because you know that they're translating that from their language into yours. And, it gives you a different level of understanding of even what they're trying to say, because when people are speaking in a second language, they're not always articulating exactly what they want to say. And as a journalist, you could easily twist that. You could easily twist that meaning because there's so many nuances that you have to take into account. So if you second guess, what they're saying, or not second guess what they're saying, but try to get deeper into what they actually mean versus what the words that come out of their mouth, you get a much more respectful view of what they're trying to get across, and it's less sensational, I think, a lot of times. So that one's done. We've got one for all the panelists. So this says, how is the country's overall turn away from language education impacting your ability to recruit qualified talent? And maybe I might ask, do you agree that the country has turned away from language education, or do you think that it's actually growing? And I don't know, who wants to start with that? Jennifer or Christian?
Sure, I can go ahead and jump in. Yes, it is difficult to find people who speak another language. And I think that while we here at CULTR in North America, it is definitely not a requirement. It's certainly something that if it is flagged on your resume, it will catch people's attention. I do see, however, I do see a change in our educational system, that people are finally starting to understand the value and the importance of this. And I think I'm also seeing it more on the university level. Just more languages in general are being offered these days than ever were before. As you said, it was either Spanish or French, right? Mm-hmm. And it's wonderful to see the expansion of these foreign language departments at the universities and so many work study abroad programs. So I do hope that we're moving in the right direction. And I do really want to just emphasize something that Steve said, which is you don't have to be perfect, and it's okay to make mistakes. And just making that effort, trying, taking a few courses will really bring you a few steps forward that, without that knowledge behind you, maybe you wouldn't have a chance at a career or a job or an opportunity that you would have before. But I'll let Christian answer that from his perspective.
I'm not sure if the country is turning away more from foreign language education than it did before in the past. I haven't spent enough time in the U.S. education system to have a qualified answer on that. However, I think there's a general underlying challenge for the U.S. educational system that is access and equity. So if you don't have the means to attend a private school or the means to move into a school zone with higher levels of education, then you're not going to have access to quality foreign language education, which is really unfortunate. So there is a societal inequity barrier to developing the language skills that would create that tide that lifts all boats. And I'm not sure if that's a recent development. In my experience, that has been the case in the US for a long, long time. So unless we as a society address the inequity question that permeates the US society, we're not going to fix that language gap problem. It's more of a philosophical point of view, but I'm not sure if there's a trend towards turning away from language education. I think that's been around for much too long.
Yeah, well, I think certainly from a national security perspective, there's a trend toward at least recognizing that we have a deficiency in certain languages that are vital for, our national interests on the world stage. And so I wanted to kind of parlay that into just a question about how should people think about which language to learn. And that's something we talked about a little bit before we got on. My personal view is it's the one that you're going to actually learn. but I don't know, how do y'all think about that? I mean, because I think people get caught up in the economic arguments so much. This one is spoken by more people. This one's spoken by companies that are in technology. This one's spoken by, the guy that I'm going to interact with down the street. And people make these decisions early on, maybe in high school or, even earlier, based on their perceptions of the quote unquote value of that language. And it's just an interesting consideration to think about. So Steve, maybe, I don't know if you've learned anything from Conversify, just like viewing your data of the sessions that are going on between language learners, or like, how do you think about that?
I think students have, or language learners in general, have different motivations for why they're learning the language. And I think, like you said, Trevor, it's learn the language that you're really going to learn. I think the extension of that is the language that you're really going to learn is the language that you're going to use. And so whether it's because you're dating somebody who speaks another language and then you're going to use it with them and their family, or it's because there's work reasons or because there's travel reasons, the majority of language learners are learning language because they want to use it for travel, at least on Conversify. So the language that they choose to learn is related to travel, but travel could be work travel. It could be, for fun. So there's a lot of reasons, but my advice is pick a language that you are going to use, because that's, you'll get constant reinforcing feedback for using that language.
Yeah. And I think that's, it's important to point out the role of culture, right? Like if you get into K-pop, for instance, that may be your entree into Korean, right?
Right.
If you're into food, absolutely, maybe you need to learn French, right? So, or fashion, so I think, a lot of people who are much better educated than me about language learning talk about the importance of doing things in that language, right? Like finding the things that are interesting you and then actually engaging in those things using that language. And that's a doubly powerful methodology for learning, from what I understand. So we have a question, actually a comment from Donna Skelsey says, Ebby says, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, Ebby, in the spirit of the comment, but not a question, but just wants to say that he or she, I'm not sure, loves Erica's respect for people's names, and I totally agree. And now I feel completely terrible that I don't know how to pronounce your name. So maybe we can get that offline at some point, but. And then, we talked about fluency earlier. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything, the difference between proficiency and fluency. Maybe, I don't know, Jennifer, do you want to talk about that? How do you define fluency from a practical business perspective versus an educational perspective?
Yes, so in the translation world, we have a very specific and defined way that we look at fluency. So of course, there's the level of being bilingual, which means that from basically birth, you grew up speaking two languages. Some people are even trilingual. If you don't fall into that category, at least from the translation world's point of view, you are not bilingual. Fluent is sort of an outdated term. We use near native. So near native is what I consider myself. I am not bilingual. I didn't start learning German until I was 18, but I am near native, which basically means that I can have a conversation about just about anything in that foreign language. And then from there, there are lower levels of proficiency. So you might be intermediate or beginner, and there's probably even some nuances in between those. You have reading proficiency, speaking proficiency, but not reading proficiency. So there definitely are different levels. And in the translation world, we also say that it is not a good idea to translate into your second language, right? So in general, if it's not something that is going to be plastered all over a billboard, if it's just for informational purposes only, I will translate into German. But if it needs to be 100% spot on, I will say to my German colleague, this one's yours. I take one into English. And I think that's important, again, just from a cultural perspective, that, I may be near native in German, but I still don't get every single thing or every nuance or every joke. And I never will, and I have to accept that.
I think the irony is that the more you learn, the more you realize how deficient you are. So
right.
Yeah, we have a related question, Jennifer, maybe you start. And I think maybe this will be a quick answer, but Zaina Khan says, nursing, she's a nursing, I guess she is a nursing major and understands 5 languages, so kudos to you. And wants to minor in French, but is obtaining a minor enough to become a translator interpreter. I think I know what the answer is going to be.
So I would say in general, no. In the translation world today, you need a degree in translations or at minimum a certificate. And again, the higher the degree you have, the better jobs you will get, the better placements you will get. A lot of translation work when you're first starting out involves not only showing your credentials, but passing translation tests and exams. So I would say if you really want to pursue a career in translation or interpretation, a minor is not enough. It's a good start, but you'll need to,
So master's or certificate in translation? Give us a quick answer on that one.
Right. So a master's is best, of course, but if you have a bachelor's degree and on top of that, you get a certificate, that should be enough to get you going, get you started.
Good point. We have one about technology. So Laura says one thing she hears at work a lot is, why do we need to teach other languages when we have Google Translate? So how do y'all address that? It is maybe Steve will jump on that one. I don't know if Erica wants to say anything about that, but go ahead, Steve. And people are also asking about your languages that you offer on Conversify as well. Maybe you can lump that in.
Yeah, I get that question all the time about Google Translate, and I think it's a real. I think there's a few pieces to the question, but I think one of the big things that people are missing is the human nuances of language, and that it's so important at building bridges between people and connections to be able to actually speak and interact. And you can get things done using Google Translate, sometimes well and sometimes not well, but you can get them done. But to really make progress and to really connect to people, which is at the heart of business, human connection, to get that done, you have to be able to do it at a human level. And so having just an earpiece that translates for you or a phone that can translate for you does not cut it. And I think that question also is totally irrelevant if you're looking at this from the perspective of non-English speakers. Because English is such an important language globally, you really need to learn English to participate in the global business world. And so using Google Translate or an earpiece, I'm sure some of you have seen folks that use Google Translate to translate their websites or translate other things. It doesn't cut it. And that's just, you know, the tip of the iceberg. So there's so many reasons, but mostly cultural nuance and developing a human connection needs to be done by humans.
All right, well, that leads into our last question. We're right at 1 o'clock, and so I want to be respectful of people's time. But I had this question, and then Brittany Turner brings it up as well. So for those of you who have worked or studied abroad, what's your favorite culture shock story? And that's what I was going to end on too, but mine was a little bit more nuanced to say, what was the point where you botched something in a language to the point that you now remember it forever? Because I think sometimes being willing to embarrass ourselves is the best way to learn. I don't know who wants to jump on that first.
I have a good one.
Sure.
My year studying abroad, my senior year of college, I got very sick. I got food poisoning, and the ambulance had to come pick me up, and the EMT really didn't speak much English. So I'm sitting in the back, and they're driving me to the hospital. And, you know, he speaks a dialect as well. And he's saying, what's wrong? What's wrong? And I didn't know how to say the word intestine. So I said, my cables hurt, because I knew the word for cables. And he looked at me and I said, you know, you have a small cable and a big cable inside. And he said, yes, yes. I got to the hospital. I got taken care of. It was all good.
There you go. Well, I told someone I met my wife in traffic instead of church in Chinese. So that's always stuck with me because the words are very similar. But anybody else want to tackle that? No?
Well, the easy one is that in Europe, most of us learn English through a British perspective. So they teach the Queen's English or Oxford English, proper English. And then I came to the US, and that sometimes was cause for confusion because I used words for things that did not apply or that caused laughter. No need to repeat here. You can Googleize all that. I think my bigger culture shock moment was not necessarily around language, but more around behaviors. And I come from a country where we tend to speak very explicitly, especially when we give negative feedback. We don't hold back. Many Germans are quite comfortable with a confrontational form of argument, and that went okay in the upper Midwest and in New York, where I had been there first, and then I moved to the US South, and that did not work at all. And that really, really hurt me, like from a business perspective, alienated people, right? People thought it was being rude, where I thought it was just being genuine in my honesty, and I learned the hard way.
Yeah, we're really, really sweet to your face here in the South. I'm just kidding. Anybody else want to address that? And then I think we'll jump off.
Yeah, the same thing, you know, as I shared, I never had the opportunity to travel abroad while studying, so didn't immerse myself. So I would just really encourage all of you who are studying to do that, because I still get the feedback, but, you know, in trying to show good intentions and practice, say, okay, you know, we're friends now. You don't have to be so formal. I learned at a university, and that's the only way I know how to speak. So that gets to be pretty embarrassing. It makes me feel like I'm super snooty when I'm trying to build friendships. And my professor was from Madrid, and again, I learned at a university setting, so it's very proper and formal. So that can be embarrassing at times. Yeah, I don't know any curse words or anything like that.
Yeah, sometimes that can work to your advantage. You can't get yourself in the trouble.
Yeah, probably so.
Anyway.
I took a course, and I learned that in Bedouin culture, Bedouin is like a nomadic tribe. I learned that in Bedouin culture, women can be pregnant for up to 18 months. And so the first time that I met a very prominent Bedouin, and we were having a conversation and we were building up trust, as I was talking about, at some point I asked him, hey, I have a question for you. How long are Bedouin women pregnant for? And he looked at me and he said, what is wrong with you? Bedouin women are pregnant for 9 months. And I felt so stupid. Like, why would I ask him that question? So anyway, that's an example of me doing something culturally so stupid. I don't know why I would ask that question, but I just couldn't believe that I had studied something that was, that people believed that. And
Well,
anyway, so.
Hey, you still remember it to this day. So, I mean, sometimes you have to be bold enough to be embarrassed, like I said, and I think that's not always a bad thing. People, understand that you're trying to learn and navigating your way, and particularly people who have studied English and have their own travails to relay. So I think we're going to have to cut it off here because we're running out of time. So thank y'all so much for your insights. We really appreciate it. A lot of the resources and the World Language Week schedule are there in the chat function for y'all to click through. And I think there's even some panels later today that attendees might be interested in. Sorry if I see one hand raised. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. But I appreciate y'all actually participating and putting those questions in the Q&A box, because that really helped us keep the conversation going. And there will be a post-event survey. So we hope that you will give us 5 stars. Not really. We just hope that you'll share your experience and help the culture team actually improve the offerings for subsequent events. So again, thanks to the panelists. Y'all did a great job. Y'all made my job very easy. And on behalf of Culture, thank you all for joining us, and hope to see y'all again soon.
Thanks,
Bye.
Trevor.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.